I never thought I'd be caught in a HOA nightmare, but here we are. My name is Ethan Carter, and 3 years ago I bought a stunning 5-acre property on the outskirts of Ridgewood Estates. It wasn't just the land that sold me, it was the beautifully restored barn, a rustic structure that I had converted into my dream workshop and home office. As an architectural engineer, I worked from home most days, and that barn was my sanctuary. When I purchased the property, I was assured that my land, sitting right at the edge of the neighborhood, would only be subject to basic HOA regulations, nothing intrusive, just simple maintenance standards. That suited me just fine. I kept my place pristine, paid my dues, and lived my life without interference. For 2 blissful years, the HOA was nothing more than an occasional newsletter in my mailbox. I barely interacted with them until Patricia Lockwood became president. Or, as most of the neighborhood secretly called her, HOA Karen. From the moment she took over, she waged a one-woman war to restore order to Ridgewood Estates, slapping homeowners with violations over the pettiest infractions. At first, I assumed I'd be spared. After all, my property wasn't even visible from the main community roads. I was wrong. The first warning came in neon pink, stuck to my mailbox like a scarlet letter, a violation notice. My barn, she claimed, was an unauthorized structure. And just like that, my battle with the HOA dictator had begun. At first, I thought it was a mistake. An unauthorized structure violation? I had all the legal documents proving my barn was grandfathered into the neighborhood's original development plans. It wasn't some rogue construction project. I hadn't built it overnight with stolen lumber. Still, I decided to handle it calmly. I emailed the HOA board, attaching my property deed and a copy of the original zoning records. I expected a quick resolution, a simple, oops, our mistake, and an apology. Instead, I got Patricia Lockwood at my doorstep. 3 days after the violation notice, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find her standing there, a thick binder clutched in her arms, her signature blonde bob perfectly in place despite the brutal summer humidity. "Mr. Carter," she said, skipping any pleasantries, "I've reviewed your documentation, and while the barn itself may be grandfathered in, its current usage as a—" She flipped a page in her binder. "Home office and workshop does not align with Ridgewood Estates' aesthetic guidelines." I stared at her, trying to process the absolute insanity of what I had just heard. "Patricia," I said, keeping my voice even. "It's Mrs. Lockwood." "Fine, Mrs. Lockwood. My property line starts 30 feet behind where we're standing. The barn is another 100 yards back. It's not visible from any road, any house, or any sidewalk. So tell me, how exactly is it affecting the neighborhood aesthetic?" She pursed her lips like she had just sucked on a lemon. "Regardless of visibility, all structures within Ridgewood Estates must align with the community's standards. I'll need to conduct an interior inspection to ensure compliance." I almost laughed. "No." Her eyes narrowed. "Excuse me? The HOA bylaws clearly state that your jurisdiction is limited to external appearances only. You have no right to enter my property, let alone inspect the interior of my private workspace." She huffed, her grip tightening on her binder. "Mr. Carter, I strongly suggest you reconsider. This isn't over." And with that, she stormed off, her heels clicking aggressively against my front porch. I figured that was the end of it. Just another power-hungry HOA president trying to test her limits. But I was wrong. Over the next few months, I started receiving violation notices for the most ridiculous things. My grass was too tall. It was within regulation. The wildflowers in my garden were unauthorized vegetation. They were native plants that attracted pollinators. A complaint about excessive noise from my barn, even though my nearest neighbor was over a quarter-mile away. It was clear what was happening. This wasn't about regulations. This was a personal vendetta. Now, let's hear from you. Have you ever dealt with an out-of-control HOA? Drop a 1 in the comments if you've had an HOA horror story, or a 2 if you think this is just the beginning of my nightmare. And don't forget to subscribe because, trust me, it gets much worse. The violations kept coming, one after another, each one more absurd than the last. By now, it was clear as day that Patricia Lockwood wasn't just enforcing HOA rules, she was targeting me. I kept meticulously documenting everything, taking photos, saving emails, keeping logs of every notice she sent. I knew I was fully within compliance, and I was prepared to fight back. But nothing could have prepared me for what came next. It was a scorching Saturday afternoon when my doorbell rang again. This time, Patricia wasn't alone. Standing behind her were three other HOA board members, all wearing matching polo shirts embroidered with the Ridgewood Estates logo. They looked like a corporate firing squad. Patricia didn't wait for an invitation. She stepped over the threshold, holding a manila folder in one hand, her expression a perfect mix of fake politeness and quiet menace. "Good news, Mr. Carter," she announced, her voice laced with an unsettling sweetness. "The board has decided to grant you an exemption for all previous violations on your property." I folded my arms, not buying it for a second. "That's interesting. And what exactly do I owe this sudden act of generosity to?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "We'd like to use your barn for this year's Ridgewood Estates Summer Gala." I blinked. "You want to use my private workspace for a party?" "A community event," she corrected, tilting her chin up slightly. "You are part of the community, aren't you?" I could feel the setup before she even said it. "In exchange for this small favor," she continued smoothly, "the board is willing to overlook certain irregularities in your compliance status." There it was, the bribe, wrapped in thinly veiled intimidation. I exhaled slowly, forcing my jaw to stay relaxed. "Let me get this straight. If I don't let you take over my property for your event, you'll start manufacturing more violations against me?" The board members shifted uncomfortably, but Patricia didn't flinch. "Mr. Carter, let's not be dramatic," she said lightly, flipping open the folder in her hands. "I'm simply pointing out that cooperation tends to make community living more harmonious." I stared at her, pulse steady, but adrenaline spiking in my veins. She wasn't asking for a favor. She was issuing an ultimatum. I took the document from her hand without breaking eye contact. It was an official request for temporary venue use, filled out with my address, my barn, and the event details. A 130-guest gathering, catered, with live entertainment. It was already finalized, as if my answer was never supposed to be no. I handed it back, my voice calm but firm. "I appreciate the offer, but my answer is no." Patricia's smile didn't waver, but her grip on the folder tightened. "We'll check back next week for your final decision," she said, then turned and walked out. The moment the door shut behind her, I knew. This wasn't over. I had expected retaliation, some passive-aggressive emails, another stack of bogus violations, maybe even a neighborhood smear campaign. But what happened next? It was outright war. It started with an email. That was my first red flag. Emergency meetings, unannounced. HOA bylaws required all members to be notified in advance of any major votes. I opened the email, scanning the contents, and my blood ran cold. The HOA had held a secret meeting and passed a new resolution, one that arbitrarily redefined property lines, claiming that my barn was now partially on community land. A complete fabrication. Attached was a horribly doctored plot map, a clumsy attempt to rewrite reality. This wasn't just manipulation anymore. This was fraud. I called Mark Daniels, my real estate attorney, within seconds. After explaining the situation, he didn't even try to hide his anger. "This is beyond illegal," he told me. "They can't just redraw your property line, and they definitely can't use that as an excuse to take control of your barn. They're bluffing, but they're doing it in a way that could cause serious legal headaches if you don't shut it down immediately." That night, Mark drafted a cease and desist letter, outlining the HOA's violations, the fraudulent nature of their actions, and the legal consequences they'd face if they proceeded. The next morning, I hand-delivered a copy to every board member's house. Patricia wasn't home when I stopped by hers, so I left it in her mailbox. The response? Not an email, not a phone call, not even another urgent resolution. Instead, I woke up to the sound of vehicles pulling onto my property. I threw on some clothes, grabbed my phone, and stepped outside, only to find 3 cars parked near my barn and a group of HOA volunteers unloading boxes of decorations. And at the center of it all, Patricia Lockwood, standing tall, arms crossed, smiling like she had already won. I stormed toward them, cease and desist, letter in hand. "What do you think you're doing?" Patricia turned, her smile widening. "Setting up for the gala, of course. Didn't you get the notice? The board vote was unanimous." I held up the legal document. "And I sent you a cease and desist letter from my attorney. You are trespassing on private property. Leave, now." One of the volunteers, a middle-aged man I recognized as the HOA treasurer, shifted uncomfortably. "Patricia, maybe we should talk about this. If he has a lawyer—" "Stop being so spineless, Jim," she snapped. He's bluffing. No one's calling the police. I pulled out my phone. Try me. Her eyes flashed with something. Anger? Panic? A final attempt to maintain control? Then, without warning, she grabbed a set of keys and marched toward my barn. And when she inserted the key into the lock, the door opened. My stomach dropped. Later, I'd find out that she had manipulated the neighborhood handyman into making a spare key, claiming I had authorized it for emergency HOA access. But in that moment, all I saw was Patricia Lockwood violating my home. This was no longer an HOA dispute. This was a crime. For a split second, I stood frozen, watching Patricia Lockwood push open the barn door, with a key she was never supposed to have. The rage hit me like a freight train. She had broken into my property, not just through manipulation and lies, but with a physical key obtained under false pretenses. I wasn't just dealing with a power-hungry HOA president anymore. This was criminal trespassing. I snapped out of it just as she stepped inside, barking orders to the volunteers. "Start clearing space. We'll set the tables along the far wall." I marched forward, voice sharp and unwavering. "Get out, now!" She didn't even flinch. She barely glanced at me as she gestured for 2 volunteers to move my drafting table, stacked with delicate architectural models worth thousands of dollars. "Mr. Carter, I'm done arguing. The board has already decided. The gala is happening here." The arrogance, the absolute audacity. I didn't hesitate. I hit dial on my phone. 911, what's your emergency? That got her attention. Patricia spun around, her eyes narrowing. "Oh, don't be ridiculous." I locked eyes with her. "I have a group of trespassers actively inside my property, using an illegally obtained key to enter without my consent. I need police assistance immediately." One of the volunteers, the treasurer, Jim, actually took a step back. "Patricia, maybe we should go." She whipped around to glare at him. "No one is leaving." But the moment she saw I wasn't bluffing, her confidence cracked. "Fine," she sneered, arms crossed. "We'll wait for the police. They'll side with the HOA just like they always do." I didn't even dignify that with a response. Instead, I stood my ground, heart pounding, waiting. The longest 20 minutes of my life. By the time a patrol car pulled up my driveway, half the volunteers had already started quietly slipping away, realizing they'd backed the wrong horse. Officer Rodriguez, a man I'd met once before at a community safety meeting, stepped out, adjusting his belt. "Mr. Carter, we got a call about trespassing?" I handed him my property deed, the cease and desist letter, and motioned toward the people still standing inside my barn. "They entered my property without permission. They used a key I never authorized. I want them gone." Rodriguez scanned the paperwork, nodding slowly before turning to Patricia, who stood with her arms folded, looking livid. "Ma'am, you need to leave," she snapped. "You don't understand. The HOA has jurisdiction. This barn is part of a community easement. We have the right—" Rodriguez held up a hand. "The HOA cannot override private property laws. Right now, you're trespassing." For the first time, Patricia looked uncertain. "You're making a mistake," she hissed. Rodriguez didn't budge. "Ma'am, if you don't leave immediately, you'll be arrested." The color drained from her face. "This isn't over," she whispered. I almost laughed. She still thought she could win. But as she finally stormed out, the only thing left behind was her failure. By the time Patricia Lockwood and her dwindling group of supporters had been forced off my property, the sun was already beginning to set. The barn door was locked, my workshop was secure, and the police had officially documented the trespassing incident. But if I thought this was the end, I was dead wrong. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of aggressive pounding on my front door. I grabbed my phone, checked my security camera feed, and sighed. Patricia. And she wasn't alone. Flanking her were 2 HOA board members, one of whom looked deeply uncomfortable, while the other tried to project some weak form of authority. Behind them, I noticed a catering truck idling at the curb. I had a bad feeling about this. I swung the door open and crossed my arms. "Can I help you?" Patricia's face was already flushed with anger. "You changed the locks." I blinked. "Of course I did." Her jaw clenched. "How dare you?" I actually laughed at that. "Are you seriously asking me why I secured my own property after you illegally entered it?" She ignored my response and instead gestured toward the catering truck. "The gala is in 4 hours. We have nowhere else to go. You have to let us use the barn." I leaned against the doorframe, letting the silence stretch between us before responding. "Actually, I don't." Her nostrils flared. You'll regret this. Patricia, I said evenly. I already do. One of the catering staff, an exhausted-looking man in a white uniform, cleared his throat. Miss Lockwood, we really need to know where to set up. We've got food in the truck, ice sculptures melting. Patricia snapped. Just set up in the Maple Drive cul-de-sac. The caterer looked genuinely confused. That's a street. We'd need permits. Just do it, she shrieked. I almost felt sorry for him, almost. But as she stomped back toward her car, furiously dialing her phone, I realized something. Patricia had officially lost control. And I wasn't the only one who had noticed. I watched from my porch as Patricia Lockwood stormed back to her car, her phone pressed so tightly to her ear that I half expected it to crack. The catering truck idled awkwardly at the curb, the staff exchanging nervous glances, waiting for instructions that clearly weren't coming. She had nowhere to go. The Ridgewood Estates Summer Gala, her grand event, was now being forced into the street, literally. And while she barked orders into her phone, reality was finally catching up with her. I should have left it at that. Let her deal with the disaster of her own making. But then my doorbell rang again. This time, it wasn't Patricia. I checked the security camera feed before opening the door, because honestly, at this point, I wouldn't have put it past her to try something even more unhinged. To my surprise, it was Jim, the Ridgewood Estates HOA treasurer, the one who had hesitated when Patricia stormed my barn. He looked nervous. I opened the door cautiously. Jim. He twisted his hands together. Mr. Carter, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I never would have gotten involved in this if I knew Patricia had lied about having permission to use your barn. I studied him for a moment. His apology felt genuine, but I could tell there was more. All right, Jim. Why are you really here? He swallowed hard. The board is holding an emergency meeting tomorrow morning to address Patricia's conduct. That caught my attention. You mean, they're finally realizing she's a liability? Jim exhaled. More than that. We've discovered she's done this before, and worse. Now I was listening. Go on. He hesitated, then finally said, Would you be willing to attend the meeting? Your experience with her would really help. I nodded slowly. Yeah, I'll be there. The next morning, I arrived at the HOA clubhouse conference room, but I wasn't alone. I brought Mark Daniels, my attorney. And as I stepped inside, I saw that I wasn't the only homeowner who had a story to tell. Patricia was late, and when she finally walked in, she froze at the sight of me. For the first time since this nightmare began, she realized she wasn't in control anymore. The tension in the Ridgewood Estates clubhouse was thick enough to cut with a knife. HOA board members sat stiffly, pens poised over notepads, while several homeowners, including myself, waited, arms crossed. The air was charged, heavy with the weight of years of frustration finally coming to a head. Then, Patricia Lockwood walked in. For the first time, she didn't have that smug, self-assured look. No clipboard, no binder full of violations. Just her and the creeping realization that her reign of terror was about to crumble. She took her seat at the head of the table, her usual spot, but Jim, the treasurer, immediately stood up. Patricia, before we begin, I want to clarify something. His voice was steady, controlled. You are not running this meeting, the board is. A murmur rippled through the room. Patricia's face twitched, but she stayed silent. Then, one by one, the complaints started coming in. Excessive rule enforcement, petty fines, unauthorized key duplication, falsifying documents, illegally holding an emergency meeting to manipulate property lines, trespassing, and the final blow, canceling a legitimate gala venue just to force her way into my barn. When it was my turn, I didn't hold back. I presented my evidence, emails, violation notices, my cease and desist letter, the police report, and, most damning of all, the fraudulent property map. I laid it all out for the room to see. Mark Daniels, my attorney, leaned forward. Miss Lockwood, my client has grounds for several serious legal claims against both you personally and the HOA as an entity. However, he's willing to consider not pursuing litigation if the appropriate actions are taken today. The room fell into stunned silence. Then Jim cleared his throat. I move that we take an immediate vote of no confidence in Patricia Lockwood as HOA president and that she be removed from the board, effective immediately. The motion was seconded before Patricia could even open her mouth. The vote was unanimous. Even her former allies turned against her. Jim stood, voice steady. Patricia Lockwood, by vote of the board, and in accordance with Section 7.3 of our bylaws regarding gross misconduct, you are hereby removed as president and board member of Ridgewood Estates. For the first time, Patricia Lockwood was powerless. Her mouth opened and closed, face twisting in fury, but no words came out. Finally, she exploded. You can't do this to me. I made this neighborhood what it is. Her chair crashed to the floor as she stood, fists clenched. This is a mutiny. You'll regret this. All of you. Security was called to escort her out. She fought them every step of the way, her final scream of outrage echoing as she was dragged from the building. And just like that, the reign of Patricia Lockwood was over. With Patricia gone, the HOA board scrambled to clean up the mess she left behind. The bogus violations were overturned, the fraudulent documents destroyed, and new policies were put in place to prevent another dictator from taking over. As for me, I got my peace back. My barn was mine again, my property was secure, and Ridgewood Estates finally felt like a community again. But there's one question that still lingers. What happens to Patricia now? Will she try to retaliate, attempt legal action, or worse, come back for revenge? Let me know in the comments. Do you think she's truly gone? Or is there one last move up her sleeve? Drop a 1 if you think she's finished, or a 2 if you think she'll come back for more. And if you loved watching Justice Served, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories just like this. Because trust me, I have plenty more to tell.